market is changing. Can your business keep up? Join me, Justin Lane, and a host of enterprise sales talent as we unravel the world of sales incentives and technology to help you become a more agile and effective leader. Learn how best-in-class organizations use data to identify and apply the right incentives at the right time to drive organizations towards success, whatever the market throws at you. Quit the guesswork and unlock the full potential in your sales team. Welcome to the Sales Compensation Show. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome to the show today the founder and CEO of Forma.ai, Nabeil Alazzam. Nabeil, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Justin. I'm glad to be on.
Nabeil, for the folks in the audience that aren't familiar with Forma.ai, can you tell us a little bit about the company and why did you start it?
I believe that there is a better way to motivate and drive a sales team. And ultimately, at Forma, we are enabling organizations to leverage the data that they have and that's available to them to produce a more dynamic, real-time, and individualized way to motivate and drive behaviors within their sales organization. And what I saw in my past life, I used to be a management consultant. In fact, obviously this is where you and I had the pleasure of meeting as CS associates. And what I saw there was this very stagnant and old way of doing things in the world of sales comp. The way I describe it is, I don't know how much has actually changed in the way that comp plans are designed today and rolled out to sales teams compared to 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And yet every other part of the world that we live in has become more dynamic. The way that marketing campaigns are rolled out are tailored and individualized. The way that we are incentivized through loyalty programs, the way that we shop, the way that that businesses target and reach out to the individualized consumer, and yet we treat salespeople as a one-size-fits-all. We look at our phones every day. We dive into the applications. We get personalized news feeds. These businesses wouldn't exist if they didn't have a personalized news feed that tailored to you. And yet we look at our sales team, and again, we say one-size-fits-all, one approach. And so I started Forma to enable organizations to be more dynamic and drive a better outcome from their sales force.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've thought about this idea of mass personalization at scale a lot over the years. And, I think about, I can go on Amazon and find an article of clothing, pick the color I like, pick the size I like, and then have it delivered, within a day or two type of thing. When you're thinking about this in the context of a sales rep or a sales compensation plan, are you talking more about the plan itself, the communication to the rep, or maybe a set of reporting to the rep, or all of the above?
I think it's all above within reason. So when I say individualized, when I say dynamic and tailored, let's start with the design of the incentive.
Okay.
So the point isn't to create, unnecessary complexity and have an individualized plan for each rep. It's that when we're thinking about the design of the optimal incentive structure for that organization, for that sales team, you're doing the analysis at the level of data that you have, which should be at the individual. And maybe when you optimize and actually look at the data and analyze it, the outcome is, look, here are the structure of plans as a base plan that can actually apply and work for everybody, but it's designed and optimized based off of the individual data. But maybe in some cases, it needs to be tailored and individualized based off the rep profile, right? The reps that are selling in the middle of Nebraska may have a very different profile, may have a very different task, customer journey, and buying journey than the reps that are in the middle of Manhattan, selling to a very different customer profile, selling to different individuals, running a different sales cycle at a different pace. And so the premise in the design phase is just leverage the data. We're ignoring, we literally analyze and design comp plans today without factoring all of the data that exists at that individual level. Okay, you design your plan, whether it's individualized or optimized with individualized data. The second step is, how do I communicate and get my sales team to understand it? And this part, again, we treat as a one-size-fits-all. We roll out and deploy a plan, one set of training that's meant to apply to everybody. Well, yeah. I can tell you right now, when you look at the world of sales, there's a lot of different profiles of successful sales professionals. The top 15% of reps across the globe in their respective industry do not look the same in all cases. They have some commonalities. And one of the commonalities that we've typically seen, and I've heard firsthand from reps that these top 5% of performers, is the beginning of the year when they get that comp plan, they're looking at their account plan and they're trying to optimize for what behavior do they need to do? What do they need to sell into specific accounts to maximize their earnings? And so the goal of individualized communication and factoring the profile of the rep that we're trying to motivate is, how do I get each rep, not just the top 5%, how do I get each rep to take their comp plan and understand it in a way that they're able to translate it to best next steps or best actions that they can take within their territory and their account plan. And then the final piece, when I think about kind of the continual and ongoing nudging, whether through that's dashboarding or reporting, it's how do I give them real-time feedback on what needs to happen? And reps behave very differently. You see some sales profiles where it's the last 2 weeks of the quarter that they bring in 90% of the deals that they bring. And then you have other reps that have this kind of consistent, structured approach, and these timeline deadlines don't matter to them as much because they're thinking about the bigger picture of their overall annual target. These individuals and these profiles need different nudges and different indicators of performance throughout the year to get them to be motivated. And so, I think it's all above, to some extent.
Yeah. As you described, like the communication and rollout, the one size fits all, two thoughts came to mind. The first one was we should probably be applying some sort of learning theory to that communication rollout. As my first thought was people have a preferred method of learning or understanding. Some people like video, some people like the written word, some people need a combination of both, or they need to experience it before they really understand it, type of thing. But I wonder if people are thinking about the different learning modalities that people have. And I think the second thing that came to mind is, I wonder if there is a correlation. I think you said that there seems to be, of what is that reaction to a new plan and what is the action that the rep takes, where top performers, from what you said, will go try to find a way to maximize their earnings. I wonder if the middle or bottom performers, have a different first thought, first reaction to the plan. And is there a way to preempt that in some way and get them to think about the plan more like the top performers?
Yeah, I think there's an element of, most reps will tell you that they're going to try to maximize their earnings, but it's these actions and the steps and how articulate. I've seen some Excel workbooks from some of these top performers where they're pulling all kinds of data from their CRM and building in different scenarios of, what if I close the revenue in this proportion across these 6 products within this customer, what does that mean to my earnings? And they're literally optimizing at that level. Now, that's an outlier, right? Not every rep is going to do that. But if we can take that and make it so that every rep is looking at their territory in a way where they're optimizing and they're approaching the sales within their business in a strategic fashion, it's just going to help them better prioritize their time. Because at the end of the day, that's ultimately it, right? Any seller within your organization, how much, where are they spending their resources, and their resources being time. And if you can help them understand what's the most valuable to the business, which in theory, your comp plan should do, right? I mean, you and I have talked about this in the past. Like, the ideal state is that you design a comp plan where, when it's gained for maximum outcome for the rep, it actually drives the right behavior. And if you're setting this strategy for your sales team, one of the biggest levers of getting to that business strategy is making sure that when you incentivize them, the outcome of that incentive is they get to the right business, like the outcome that we want for the business. And so if I can get them to take that, translate it to what they need to do to maximize their earnings, if I've designed the plan well, it aligns perfectly with what I need from my sales team. So
yeah, I love the image you paint of a sales rep out there building a MBA capstone statistics project in Excel to monitor his comp. I'm like, maybe they might be in the wrong job. Maybe we need them on the data analytics side of the house versus sales. But I agree. I've seen these sheets, and the good and the bad is that oftentimes they may not match up, with the same process that the comp admin team is going through to calculate payment results. Yep. And then it's a reconciliation process between the team that's officially doing it and the rep who is doing it as a side gig.
Yeah, 100%. I mean,
yeah, correctly.
It's interesting because I've seen a case where, again, very strong performing rep, kind of like, think about like President's Club, top of the President's Club on an annual basis, did this model, took this approach, is taking this approach every year. They rolled out a new comp plan, didn't understand the nuances, the mechanics of the plan, didn't make as much money as he thought he would. And then it just created this really negative interaction. I mean, this is a top performer that's taking a strategic approach to their business. You want to keep people like that around. You want to make sure that there's, positive engagement. So going back to the training, how do you train certain people? And it's not the same for everyone, right? Is there an example, or do you need to provide a way to kind of run through their plan and action it? Back to the training. One thing I will say, and this is something that I you see quite a bit. No one likes to talk about comp, right? People shy away from talking about compensation in general because it's not a easy dialogue to have for most people. And so what happens when you roll out sales compensation? You roll out the plan at the beginning of the year. The managers try to get it done as fast as possible. They don't want to talk about quotas. They don't want to talk about sales comp plans. They roll it out, and then no one wants to bring up that awkward conversation. And so I've seen, we've rolled out surveys. I've worked at, with both in the past when engaged with reps in my consulting days as well as at Forma. And what we've seen is there's been cases where we're in the middle of an implementation, so we're onboarding a customer to our platform. We're interviewing their sales reps, and you ask the manager how many of their how confident they are that their reps understand their plan, and then you talk to the reps and find out how many actually understand their plan. It's a massive gap. These are reps that are asking questions about their plan 3 quarters into the year. Mm-hmm. If you don't understand your comp plan, how are you actually driven and motivated to drive the right outcome for the business? You're not. So,
no, I've always said people are just going to do what they're good at or what's easy, and the pay is disconnected as opposed to being a driver of behavior. And yeah, I think I've seen survey data. There was a company, I want to say it was CSO Insights, or it might have been the CEB, but they did a survey one time, and it was somewhere in the low 30s. Let's say 33% of reps raised their hands and said, "I don't understand how I'm supposed to get paid." And that was just fascinating to me when I saw that. I'm like, it's one of those statistics where like that can't be true. And then as you talk to people, and you talk certainly to comp admin teams that field disputes throughout the year, they're like, "Oh, that's true." People are asking or have a misunderstanding of how they're actually getting paid. Like you said, into Q3 of a planned year, they still don't get it. Let's jump back a little bit. So you made this point where you feel like maybe companies, like the process of comp plan design hasn't really changed a lot in maybe 40 years. And so you started a software company to address this problem. Like what was that? Talk me through this thought process.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because you see things and sometimes you see things, they don't make sense, but you think this is kind of the status quo and you're waiting to learn more. And so, I remember even some of my first projects that I did when I was at ZS, where first and foremost, the people that are designing the plan, like the tools, the people, the teams involved in the design process are not the same as the tools and the people and the teams involved in the execution process. There may be slight overlap, but they're completely disconnected. Yeah, it's completely disconnected. And so we would do this design process. And I remember being in a meeting where, we're about to roll out a plan to the ops and comp team as a part of our strategy. And someone puts up their hand and says, "We can't actually calculate that plan because that metric doesn't exist. It's going to take us over 6 months to bring it in." This is again, you're early in your career, you hear these things and you're like, "Okay, well, I don't know, maybe this is the way that business operates." But it didn't feel right. And it felt wrong that we were, why were we stuck in this old process? And then you see it time and time again. It's happening in every business. At first, maybe it's a one-off occurrence. Okay, it's this business. They're not very sophisticated. But in reality, this is the lay of the land. Design, like planning and execution, are completely disjointed today. The second part is that every platform in this space, having experience implementing or being on the implementation side of this process, every platform is effectively this toolkit to help you solve the calculation of the actual payout. But I need to solve it for my business. And so I basically architect and I design the data pipelines based off of my needs as a customer. But every one of these instances is isolated. It's done in siloed fashion. In fact, I've worked with some organizations where different divisions within that company have this implementation of the same software, but it's different instances. And you have 2 teams in different parts of the organization, or different geos, maybe different business units, that are basically building rules where, yes, okay, in aggregate, there are different business rules and different data, et cetera. But at a more granular level, you realize there's a lot of similarity in what you're doing, and you couldn't copy paste from one instance to another in a streamlined way that was efficient and enabled you to actually not replicate work. And so, I left consulting thinking about this and being like, well, why can't we use the tools that we pay to do the strategic planning? And ultimately, it's because of this siloed and very repetitive and rigid nature to the way that we think about payouts, where if it takes you weeks to configure a plan and you need a new instance to configure a test case every single time, you're not going to set up 10 sandbox instances of these platforms and then configure 10 different plans that you're modeling to financially figure out which one you want to go with. It would take you months and months to do that. And so what do? You keep design over here and you model it based off estimates, and you're doing it in Excel to create your ideal plan. And so I left actually thinking that I left consulting. I wanted to go into tech. And that's when I got reached out to by a customer I'd worked with in the past and helped them implement one of these platforms. And so when they reached out asking for help because they were having issues and problems with the calculations, again, business upstream data change, upstream business rule change caused havoc on their implementation. And so all of a sudden, bring back the person who helped us implement it because he knows the architecture of how we design this. And so come back in, help them re-architect, get it set up, get their teams, ready to go again. And then a year later, lo and behold, same issue. They need help again. And that was when I had the opportunity of pitching this idea of bringing strategy and execution together and ultimately removing the repetitiveness and the manual nature of building rules, and ultimately commoditizing the rule building by taking the business context of the plan design and translating it automatically to the underlying rules. And so this element of, why did I start a software company? Well, I started a software company to solve this problem. I think there's a massive gap in the market. I lived and breathed being in that role as a sales comp admin and sales comp, implementation partner. And I saw how painful it was for my customers. One of the most defeating things was we'd go through an implementation, and at the time back in in 2012, 2013, the ICM players were just kind of getting out of the woodworks. Like, for the most part, like exactly was less than a 10-year-old company at the time. And so, in my mind, every one of these projects was mostly greenfield. They were trying to implement these new platforms that were supposed to solve this problem. And you had these comp teams that you got very close with. You get very close to these people during an implementation project because it's long hours, hard work. And so the excitement of these implementations, and everyone's super excited for this future state of comp. And then the rollout happens and it's a complete letdown. And I saw that too many times.
Yeah.
Too many times and too many failures to not want to solve this problem. So I started and built this company because I felt the pain so harshly myself.
Yeah. I think you were on different projects than I was on, because mine were miserable. The excitement had died somewhere early in the project.
Early in the project, yeah.
Now, you touched on something that, again, near and dear to my heart when I was more on the implementation, involved with implementations. But this idea that every implementation, we just started from scratch. And that drove me crazy of, you had solved the puzzle before, but you couldn't leverage that, on a new account. And then when you came in to somebody who had already implemented something, it took time to try to figure out what somebody else had done, because there was, there's 10 ways of solving the problem within the solution. And, a lot of times people aren't thinking about efficiency or ability to maintain, like when they're configuring these systems. They're just thinking about, how do I get the right answer quickly and brute force a solution, type of thing. And so you'd have to go unwind what somebody else had done. But those were two things that really stuck out as I saw from platform to platform. Very similar experience of start from scratch and, try to figure out what other people had done that probably wasn't very good.
And, I think there's an element of, what is it, the old adage or the old saying, like if you ask someone, if Ford had asked the customer what they wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse. What they really needed is a car.
I was thinking of a different Ford quote where he said, hey, they can have it any color they want as long as it's black.
Yes. That is true. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is a right. Yeah. In that case, the right way was just to kind of keep the process as simple as possible to get the execution. But in my mind, I think, we've approached this and you're starting to see, I think, this next generation of similar type of platforms. And effectively, it's these toolkits. Hey, it's a spreadsheet in the cloud, or it's a simplified way to build. Here's the next generation of exactly these VeriSense and Calidus.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's still a toolkit where you're right. Every time you implement these things, it's starting from scratch. And I think by the nature, what we're used to using and what we're used to doing, it's hard to change, right? It takes a lot to kind of make that shift to say, okay, no longer am I going to encode this formula every single time. I'm actually going to leverage this pre-built building block. And so now if it takes me significantly shorter to execute on a plan design or plan build, because I'm no longer having to do that, right? That's just done through Forma. What does my role look like? And I think that, that question is that now that changed the comp admin and that comp team. Well, I mean, I asked comp like teams that we work with, before the implementation, I've asked this question of like, how many comp teams have this list? I've seen it firsthand. It's a massive list of things that they want to do to improve the process, to make their compensation process better. This list of enhancements and like to-dos that keeps on building up every single month.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when do they get a chance to work on it? Well, the last week of the month, you're preparing for the beginning of the month and accruals and payroll. The first week, you're actually doing the work. The second week, you're preparing, you're catching up with anything that came over or anything that stretched the deadline. And then you get a third week of the month where maybe you can breathe if has not been any emergencies or any blow-ups. And by that time, I was talking to a comp team and actually asked them this, and the feedback I got was, oh, by that time, we take time off because we've been working like 90 hours a week for the last 3 weeks. And so when do you get a chance to actually elevate the organization's sales comp process? It's very difficult. It's a thankless role, right? And no one, and I think it goes back to kind of the shift of, if we stop having to build from scratch every single time, it actually finally enables the comp team to push things forward and move the organization in the direction that they want.
Yeah, we did something very similar. We did a roundtable yesterday, and one of the participants, it was kind of in this mode of they had implemented, and things were running smooth. And I'd used the term, the automation of generic repeatable tasks, and that got eyebrows raised up. And he's like, yes, yeah. He goes, the stuff that my folks used to work on, they don't have to do again and again and again. And so I said, well, what are they working on now? And it was an interesting mix of they were thinking about and working with their business partners and stakeholders in sales to figure out what sort of reporting and analytics do they want to do. They're thinking about how to measure the effectiveness of the comp plan. And again, higher order stuff. And I'm like, what's the stress level like now versus when they were stuck in this world of doing, these same manual tasks and very limited tools again and again and again. And it was just a chuckle and the classic, night and day. And I'm like, okay, good. It feels good to hear these stories of, you're not, because again, I think like you're kind of getting to this idea of this, maybe a misconception almost that automation takes away jobs. So I'm like, no, automation changes lives. And in this case, in a positive fashion, right? They have a better job than they had before, more satisfying, more rewarding, less stress.
100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think if you actually think about humans by nature, right? Like if you think about the world that we live in, we all want to be doing something that's meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And in this globalized world, if you're not doing something meaningful in your current job, there are a bunch of other companies like globally that you can work with to do something meaningful. And I think the interesting thing, last time I saw, I think the average tenure of a sales comp admin was less than a year and a half. And it was, like a sales comp team member. That did not surprise me, because what I saw, when you think about this, these are technically sophisticated people. They come in, they understand the business because they're talking to senior stakeholders. They come in, they see the data, they're looking at this, and they're basically, they have these ideas to make it better, but they're caught up doing the same thing day and day and day and day over and over and over again. It's like, that's not a way to really empower and enable these smart individuals. And so, in my mind, as humans, we want to be creative and we want to be making decisions.
Yeah.
The repetitive work is not what feels meaningful to us. Not
I
to
want
say that
to,
it's not any,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I was going to share with that statistic. What is fascinating to me is that I know a lot of people that have been in the industry 15, 20 years doing sales comp admin. And so that, when you say less than a year, I'm
Or a
like,
year and a
man,
half, less
it's
than a year and
a
a half.
year and a
But
half.
yes.
Okay. I go, it's
Yeah.
really shorter than that because there's some outliers to the other side. There's no middle. And I've always,
Yes.
the people that I've talked to that have been doing it for
Yes.
15, 20 years, these are folks that could have been air traffic controllers, school bus drivers, right? People that are just unfazed by chaos.
Yes.
And I've always said it's one of the most thankless jobs, like in business,
Yeah.
because very rarely, and I've asked many comp admin this, tongue in cheek, to get a gauge of how broken their process and tools are, to say, hey, when was the last time somebody called you, picked up the phone, called you, or sent you a note saying thank you for paying me correctly? And they're always like, what? And this, I'm like, versus obviously what happens is, how many times has somebody picked up the phone or sent them a note to complain or yell that they've been paid incorrectly, which is the
100%.
most common thing. They don't. It's a thankless job, and they have had limited tools to help support that business process. And kudos to the folks who have stuck with it. They're a different breed. And yeah, empathy for these folks that come into it, like you said, bright-eyed, plenty of ideas, but bang their head against the wall until they probably figure out something else to do
Yeah.
within their organization or elsewhere.
No, I mean, again, this goes back to like why I started the company. I lived that. I would
Yeah.
go back in, work with these customers, and in this particular case, with the customer that I had implemented, and going back in and fixing the process. There's no thanks when you get it right. There's only noise, and it's massive noise if you get it wrong, right? And I think there's an element of to some extent, I've asked team members that join Forma this very question, so that I can highlight it for them. And I say, has anyone here, like some of the new joiners that joined the team, and I have a chance to talk to them, I was like, has anyone here ever reached out in their past role and thanked their payroll team? Nope. Has anyone here had a payroll issue? Yep. That's when I talk to payroll. And I think it's the same extent with sales comp. The difference is the number of times that payroll changes. Maybe you get a salary bump, maybe you get a new role, maybe you get benefit changes. What, a few times a year? Yeah. Every month on a variable incentive plan, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of business rules that need to be applied to get that number accurate. And it's complicated. The sales comp team they're in the middle. They play this middle role where they have to deal with data issues upstream. They have to deal with data issues from the business, right? So if their systems are not generating the right data, it's a problem. And if they don't get the right business logic, a territory change, an override, or whatever from the business, it's a problem. And you're right, it's a completely thankless role. And so the more that you can build automation around it and elevate them to build a more strategic way to execute and operate, the better it can be.
Let's shift a little bit. So what does the future of sales compensation look like if somebody could have a platform, access to the data, a nice clean process? What does the future look like?
So when you bring strategy and execution together, that's kind of the first piece, right? We need to, planning and execution need to be fully connected. And what I mean by that is, I'll kind of give an example. If today a component of your plan is you had AEs that focused on enterprise versus AEs that focused on mid-market, the CRO were to ask the question, what if I shifted my enterprise threshold from 1,500 employees to 2,000 employees?
Okay. So easy segmentation question of
easy segmentation question, right? Okay. I just want to shift one variable. Today, for them to model out the financial impact of the business, the potential risks, the winners and losers on the sales team, to better understand how to deploy that, I actually think that would take weeks to months of analysis today.
Yeah, not easy.
Not easy.
But I'm saying an easy question to come up with, what if, but no capability to figure out what it means.
Yeah. And so right away, if we are limiting ourselves to the number of what if questions that we can ask, because the planning and execution side are completely disconnected, as a CRO, I have to think very, very clearly about what my hypotheses have to be very right. I have to have a lot of confidence in my hypothesis of what those scenarios that I want to test on, because I only have so many resources to do that. So the first step is, if you connect planning and execution, you enable those what if scenarios to be tested in an automated way. What if that threshold, that segmentation threshold changes? Right away, all of the downstream variables get updated. The crediting logic for the comp plan, the quotas, the quota setting, right? So if it's fully connected, the quota setting approach that's built up off of the accounts and the potential in the territory is based off of the segmentation that is covered in that territory. And so right away, if that gets updated, then you run a commission model based off of these updated rule sets. And now you can generate a financial impact. Then you compare against the previous scenario, determine the winners and losers and the potential risks to the business. Why can't you have that be completely run in an automated fashion? So that's the first phase one of going to this future that we're building towards is businesses need to have a platform and in a way to kind of connect planning and execution and execute on that. Once you do that, now it opens a second stage, which is I can now start to do my analysis and my strategy building, not just in an aggregate and a one-size-fits-all way. Now I can start modeling based off the data at the individual level. And so if you think about today, it's already so complicated to do these what-if scenarios and these planning cycles. I only can do a few. So I either do them in a lot of detail and only do one or two, or I take estimates and I can maybe do 6 or 7 a year. So, but now that we've automated that process, now I can start bringing other data, right? Behavior of the rep at the individual level. How does one rep sell versus another? We talked earlier about this concept of the rep that sells in the last 2 weeks of the quarter versus the rep that's consistent. What about the reps that engage and talk to customers on a certain cadence versus others? What about the reps that are more likely to be on kind of outbound on phone versus by email? All these different parameters, these different behaviors that feed into our analysis of understanding the rep's profile, that then feed into our ability to understand the incentive connected to the profile. And so now we can start building plans based off all the data that we're collecting and understanding about our sales team. And so now we're individualizing our comp plans, whether it's actually creating individual plans or just leveraging that data to create the optimal plan structure for that team. The final phase is actually being proactive. And if I really think, again, let's take a 10-year out picture. Think about where we were 10 years ago. The iPhone had just barely made it into the hands, of the early adopters. And if I think about 10 years ago to where we are today, or if I think about 20 years ago, if we fast forward, why is it that a rep wakes up today, or frankly, why is it that a rep wakes up 10 years from now and is not in real time told what their incentives are based off of that moment, based off of that current situation? And so in a future view, I wake up as a sales rep that day based off the market dynamics, based off of what's happening in the business, the priorities at a customer or product level. My compensation, my structure is tailored to that individual moment. Now, I want to be very clear on this. It sounds crazy, right? Like, Matt, every day my comp plan changes. That doesn't sound fun. I'm not suggesting it changes every day, but it also doesn't sound fun when the COVID lockdowns happened. And if all of a sudden you're a rep that's impacted by that, to wait 6 to 8 to 12 weeks for my business to respond with an updated comp plan to tell me how I'm going to hit my livelihood, that's also not fun either. And so the point is it's so dynamic that it is real time. I mean, I think about the the element of think about the FX rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
why is the FX
strong dollar this year?
Yeah, strong dollar this year, right? And it's dynamic. It's based on every day it changes. Actually, the volatility of the FX this past year has been crazy. It kind of, and being on the Canadian side, means a great deal because there's a lot of business, trade that we do with the US. And so
this is something I think you look at more than I do. Being on the other end of it, yeah. On
the other end of it, right? And so, I've seen the US to Canadian dollar go from 1.39 back down to 1.33 and went back up to 1.38 in the matter of like a week and a half. And like sometimes within a day, it's a massive volatility. And so, but you have to ask yourself, why is it that it's that dynamic? It's because information flow has accelerated over the last 50 years to a level where, of course, it's going to be this dynamic. And it's real time and everyone has visibility and I can make decisions based off that. So why is it that I wake up as a sales rep and the world does not look today the same as it did look? Like the way it looked in Jan 1st when I got my plan, or I should have got my plan, does not look the same as today. And so why is it that my comp plan isn't changing and isn't dynamic based off the nature? And I'll give you 2 reasons for that. The reason why it doesn't change today and everyone's adverse to change is because educating the rep on what the plan means is very difficult. to do in today's world. Talk about the training, right? People understand incentives in very different ways. And so if you don't get them to understand it, it's a problem because it's their livelihood. So what do people do? This adage of like, keep plans simple. By the way, I agree with keeping plans simple, but the actual important part of that is not keeping plans simple. It's keeping plans or making plans so that they can be understood. And sometimes it doesn't need to be simple for it to be well understood. It just means that you need to really focus on education and training. And we see this with some of our customers where there's certain dynamics in the business where they have to have slightly more, nuanced or complex aspects of their plan. And if you're going to do that, then you need to make sure you invest, 2 to 3x as much as you're going to invest in the training and onboarding of that plan. But in the future, if we can get the reps to understand what that incentive means in real time, then the dynamic nature of the plan no longer becomes a problem, as long as it's fair, equitable, and designed to pay for performance. Because frankly, as a leader or sales leader in an organization, you shouldn't care if your bottom performers are upset by the plan.
Yeah.
If you don't perform, you should get out of the business. I mean, it is a pay for performance. That's what variable compensation for sales reps is. It's pay for performance. And it's actually unfair. You say this all the time, and I quote you on this. It's this reverse Robin Hood. I love, that reverse Robin Hood is exactly the nature of the way sales comp should be. Steal from the poor to pay for the rich, right? And there's this element of the dynamic nature of comp should be done at an individual level. Is it 10 years out? Is it 15? Is it 20 years out? I mean, I think it's closer to 10 years because every other part of our world lives this way. I wake up, like I said, my news feed and whatever platform I use is different. It's tailored to me. My loyalty programs are tailored to me. The way that I engage with the entire world is tailored to me and my profile and how I digest data information. And yet we're still treating salespeople like it's the early days of the information technology revolution.
Yeah, as you describe that, I think there's this interesting intersection, right? I see different tools where people, have listening tools, like where they're looking for, news about one of their companies that are in their territory, or if, a person changed jobs, scraping from LinkedIn type of thing. And, kind of back to this idea of in the short term, can we help inform people where their greatest opportunities to go make money or where they have money at risk even because, they're the person they identified as their economic buyer or champion within an organization left. And so if they want to save the money they were going to make on that account, they better pick up the phone and replace that champion with somebody new in a pretty quick fashion. But again, I've thought about there was a Nobel Prize given out between this idea of, the wants and needs of an organization and the wants and needs of a person. And what ties those two things together are incentives. And, how do you take advantage of that to the benefit of both parties?
Yep.
And, I think that, there's a long ways to go of how technology enables that process, whether it's the how, the motivation of how much. I think but again, people are at all different levels of maturity kind of down that curve. And I think that the vast majority of companies are still kind of stuck in this idea of, hey, we just want to pay people right, on time type of thing. They're at ground zero of sales performance management because they have had, again, disconnected processes, poor tools to help enable the planning and execution process, and teams that don't talk to each other. And they're stuck. It is behind the curve to what I see a lot of other areas in business.
I mean, and I'll go back to, I think, one of the biggest instigators and the drivers of that. It's the fact that we do it in a siloed fashion. If you think about the Facebooks, the LinkedIn's, the Starbucks loyalty programs of the world, right? Why are they able to, again, or look at something like TikTok. There's like that algorithm and the ability to capture the attention of those individuals. They're doing it for the entire collective, right? That is their business, and they're focusing nothing but figuring out what incentivizes and retains that capturing that user's time or that audience. And that's not a small problem to solve. It's a massive, complicated problem. And for businesses to try to solve what's the best way for us to optimize and understand how to create the perfect incentive plan for our sales team, it is not just a siloed, every business can't become the best at doing this, which is where, again, the future of, and the reason why we architected Forma in the way that we did. It's my vision that we should learn from across the entire globe of every customer, how incentives are tied to behavior, and how for this rep profile, this incentive is projected to drive X behavior out. And so by leveraging the learnings across every single customer, we can actually start to then predictively and proactively make those recommendations. I mean, I mentioned this dynamic nature. Well, how do you do that? You need to leverage the data across the collective to do so. And you can't have every company in the world try to solve this on their own. It's not their go-to-market. The Facebooks of the world, the LinkedIns of the world, that is their core business. If they don't capture attention from their audience, there is no business.
Yeah. So Nabeil, one more idea that I wanted to bring up from a conversation we had once, and then two questions I like to ask every guest on the show. But the idea is, for a founder, for a CEO of a software company, how important do you believe it to be for that person to have some experience, domain expertise in the space of what they're trying to do, how they're trying to help their clients and customers?
So, I mean, the simple answer in sales compensation, I think it's highly important, but I want to give the framework of why I think that is. So if you're solving a simpler problem, and I want to classify it because, like, is there ever a simple problem? If you can take any problem and make it extremely complex and unpack all of the aspects to it. And I want to caveat all of this with the fact that every CEO and founder should become an expert in their space. And if they're not close enough to the problem, I don't think they're actually solving the problem. And so there are some businesses that are basically making use of an arbitrage opportunity. There are businesses that are making use of a demand that is, articulated in a way that's a kind of a lower level order complexity, right? There's a very clear demand of, I need to do X, Y, and Z, and that's what you're tackling. But in those businesses that are making use of an arbitrage opportunity or something like that, the actual problem is, how do I tackle the execution, the go-to-market execution of this? Not necessarily the actual problem that they're solving. So they need to be really good at that, have prior experience there, I think, in order to be able to excel at this problem better than others. When you're solving a very complicated problem, and I think, when I say a complex problem like sales comp, where it's been attempted many times over with a very similar outcome through every generation of the solution, sometimes you don't need to have expertise in the sales compensation or in that space, but you take a radically different approach, and it's so radically different that it actually works. And I think you can see this in some other industries where sometimes a product that completely revolutionized, like if I think about how enterprises in the 1980s and the 1990s captured and managed their filing system, the early founders of data platforms like, or data management platforms like the Dropbox of the world, probably didn't have the full experience of how they manage files and folders. I'm not using the best analogy here, but there's an element of, in some cases you take a radically different approach to take a shortcut to the problem, to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. But in a situation where, I think I look at sales compensation, we have this radically different vision of how it's going to operate, but you can't ignore all the complexities of the current state of how enterprises manage and execute on it. And without that experience, it's very easy to think you can shortcut and take a step and miss all of the other observable problems. And so, I take a look at some of the other platforms in the space, and I think I think I may have gone way over on this. And again, I'm being overcomplicated. I'm overcomplicating this one.
Yeah, I think there's something to the idea, though, of bringing a radical, transformative approach, as well as deep domain expertise, that probably leads to the best outcome ultimately for the clients of the company, as opposed to, either some companies have neither, some companies have one. I think you've built a company where Forma has both.
I think there's an element of the ability to kind of have that radical vision of the future, but a way to step the customers through that journey, especially in sales comp. You need, I think, having that deep domain experience and having seen it yourself and solved the problem yourself, I think, is quite critical.
All right. Two final questions. First one, Who in the world of sales comp would you most like to take to lunch?
This is a hard one. Part of me feels like saying, it actually wouldn't necessarily be someone in the world of sales comp, someone in the world of, kind of an academic or researcher in the world of behavioral economics and kind of understanding or this behavioral psychology of incentives. But at the same time, I think this could be a good opportunity to kind of talk to someone in the world of sales comp that is like extremely experienced and has seen a lot. So I don't know if you have any is there, I guess, I don't know, is there any do you have a suggestion?
No, I think that what you actually answer there is a pretty common answer. I think people that have been on the show thinking about who they'd want to take to lunch, they're thinking about that question in a different way, as opposed to maybe, a thought leader in the specific domain space. People have answered this idea of, trying to, a book author around behavioral economics or psychology, of how people think. And it's interesting because as I talk to more people on the show, I'm starting to see this really interesting intersection of different backgrounds, where some people are bringing an arts background, right, to it. Your college education is in engineering, correct?
Yeah.
Right. So bringing engineering background to the table, and so I think people, there's all these very interesting fungible skills that people are bringing to the table. But I think this next, hurdle or next thing that a lot of folks are thinking about is how do people think and how can we apply that, into sales compensation? All right. Last question. As evidence from what's behind me, I like to read, always looking for a good book recommendation. Could be in the world of business, sales comp, or other interest. Any recommendations on something to read next?
It's hard because there's so many great books, I think, and it's very much, it's time. What's the best way to say it? It's also like very time relevant. What are the things that you're kind of encountering in that moment? But a recent book that I read, I typically try to read, fiction and nonfiction in parallel, kind of keeps creative juices flowing, and then kind of more the introspective and action-based kind of nonfiction. So I'd say I recently read Amp It Up by Frank Slootman. I really enjoyed that one. I think just hearing kind of what he was able to do and his approach to to truly taking a very operational focus on running a business. And then on the fiction side, I've been reading the Three Body Problem trilogy, over the past little bit, and I've really enjoyed those books.
I've seen this Three Body Problem books at bookstores, whether at the airport or, the Barnes and Noble. And every time I read the jacket cover, I'm like, this is a book that's going to force me to think. And when I read fiction, sometimes I want a book that's not going to make me think really hard, but it looks like a good series.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's something you said about, I think this, science. You read some of, Isaac Asimov or Aldous Huxley, and you read these books that are older, and you think back and you're like, how amazing, would it have been to be in those time periods and have read those books and seen that vision of the future, and how, in some cases, how accurate it was.
Yeah.
And so, I think reading kind of like the science fiction that's being produced in our time and seeing what we're talking about in 80, 100, 200 years out is quite interesting, and it kind of paints a very different perspective. Whereas again, you read a nonfiction book, it's very much a look at the current state of the world and kind of the more immediate 5 to 10 years out, typically.
All right. Well, Nabeil, that brings us to the end of our time together on the Sales Compensation Show. I want to thank you so much for taking the time today to have a conversation, and I thoroughly enjoyed it and really appreciate you coming on the show.
Absolutely. Likewise, Justin. I really enjoyed the conversation.